Okay, cool. I think we can kick off. So, welcome, guys. We're up to lecture 7. Hi, everyone on the call. I see Zara, Shirin, Krish, Daphne, Mina's in the room and on the call, so she's doubling up, and Shivank. Um, so today, actually, I'll just check. Audio okay? Can I get a thumbs up?
All good.
Thank you. So today we're going to switch tracks a little bit, just a little bit, relative to stuff we've been talking about so far, and think a little bit about some stuff in the area of cognitive science, essentially. So firstly recall the thing I always do and say, this is where we're at with our syllabus. This is the updated one. Yeah, okay. And we, broadly speaking, initially we're going on this journey for the first few lectures up spatial scales. We're done with that, although it will kind of stay with us. And so now we're kind of picking kind of topics that relate to things we've thought about in relation to neural systems at various scales and other stuff, kind of applications, if you like. And if you remember from the very first lecture, I gave you this shtick about the field of computational neuroscience being this broad church that, broadly speaking, has 2 types of things that people work on in computational neuroscience. We work on stuff to do with coding, information coding, cognition, and stuff to do with neural dynamics, or if you like, broadly speaking, neurophysiology. And these are kind of quite different things, but often we can kind of span, have one foot in both of these, or span this explanatory gap, essentially, that pretty much still persists between what we think and know and understand about, the mind, broadly speaking, and the brain. And when we're able to do that, when we're able to kind of combine our knowledge of this side and our knowledge of this side, then I think we're doing that's the holy grail, if you like. But I think that's where a lot of interesting and valuable new progress and kind of human knowledge lies. So that's something that we are going to be covering today. We're going to be thinking about some things that are like abstract cognitive models of information processing that are basically coming from psychology. And we're still going to look at neurons. So neurons, and looking at a little bit about kind of firing rate models and Poisson neuron models and so on. But broadly speaking, like a little bit of this and a little bit of that today. Okay. One way of describing this, I think I used this phrase earlier, is the neural code. Okay. So this is a pretty loaded phrase, pretty loaded term. Like, there isn't one neural code, there isn't one definition of a neural code, but broadly speaking, like, that's the kind of thing that we're interested in talking about here, is like, what are the ways in which neurons that we can measure, also neurons kind of as manifested through the behavioral activity of organisms, usually human organisms. What does that tell us about the properties and the kind of organization of neural coding? Okay. So we can kind of think about this as a how and a why. I talked about dynamics and physiology, dynamics and cognition. These are the things we're kind of tackling today. So one big area, or the one that we're mainly going to focus on here, is in cognitive neuroscience, is trying to understand some of the mechanisms and the kind of structures around the behavioral aspects of tasks we can kind of broadly characterize as decision making, particularly for the purpose of today. I would maybe add in like perceptual decision making, or kind of speeded decision making. You'll see what that means in a second. But the general question is this: how do we model the brain? How do we kind of understand even think about how to model the brain, given that when it's making decisions, particularly given that there's a variety of sources of noise and variability in information that we get, and to some extent the kind of machinery of the decision-making process itself, let's say. So the kind of classic model in cognitive psychology for modeling particularly kind of perceptual decision-making is called the drift diffusion model, or the DDM. And the general idea here is, I should take a step back. So when we're doing, say, behavioral psychology, cognitive science, cognitive neuroscience even, there's kind of useful little piece of information. It's kind of a 101 in the psychology point. Like 90% of everything we know about the properties of the human mind, let's say, but as far as we can kind of characterize them quantitatively, comes from two types of things. Comes from reaction times and error rates, okay, on tasks. I mean, there's things we know that we have more of a other ways that we've pulled that together, kind of qualitatively and through different kind of conceptualizations of cognitive domains. But in terms of data that we can get quantitatively from human subjects in a controlled experimental context, there's a very limited number of things you can do. So reaction times and error rates, those are kind of the two kind of real big currencies of that type of science. In case that's not clear, so what that means is, broadly speaking, like you've got some task. It could be like see an image, you have to press a button at a certain when you see a certain image, or hear a certain sound, or make a classification, pink or red. The details don't matter right now, but you have a task, and then there's two things that you need to do. You need to make the classification, and you need to do it quickly. Okay, so we'll call speeded tasks. So in that kind of very large family of kind of experimental designs or experimental paradigms where we can have like speeded decision-making tasks, the speed helps, because the speed is it kind of gives information, some of which we'll elaborate on here, but it's kind of adds sensitivity to the doing speeded tasks. Speeded tasks typically have more information in their response properties than non-speeded tasks. That's maybe one way of putting it. And then obviously the decision bit is like, did you get it right? Did you get it wrong? Right? And like, broadly speaking, you want to get stuff right. So if you got stuff wrong often, that indicates that you're either struggling on the task, or that you have some cognitive deficit if you're kind of thinking in a clinical space, or that you're kind of calibrating the difficulty of the task. That informs how you calibrate the difficulty of the task, right? So these two things, reaction times and error rates, those are a lot of how we kind of structure experimental designs that involve behavioral responses. And we also have this kind of relationship between reaction times and knowledge, broadly speaking, or say kind of ability to do task, maybe would be a more general way of stating it, where if it's easy, then you will react faster. So your reaction time will be faster. And what is it makes it easy? Well, various things. Like is it a difficult task? Do you have the information you need to do it? Do you have some of the information you need to do it? So on and so forth. There's a lot of things. But those two things kind of go together in a sense of like how fast you can respond is also related to how much information you have that you need in order to respond. I know that's quite general, but I'm trying to just encapsulate quite a large number of paradigms in the words I'm using here. But one specific example that we've got nice visualization of in the tutorial. So if you can kind of suspend your judgment or use your imagination or just be patient, like when we pull up the collab notebook in the second half, we've got a movie of this so you can see. And maybe some of you guys have seen this before, but in case you haven't, so this is a common type of perceptual kind of visual perception experiment called coherent motion, where you have a bunch of dots on a screen, and the dots are moving around, and they're moving around with some level of coherence that we can calibrate kind of fully. So fully coherent motion will be all the dots are all moving left to right, for example, up, down, whatever. And then 0 would be completely random, and then we have something in the middle. Okay. And the thing that you see, so this is what I'm saying, you'll kind of see this in the movie, in the tutorial, is like there's a big there's actually a kind of a point between here and here where you just it starts to jump out. There's a kind of a gestalt aspect to the perception of coherent motion where you go from like random noise more or less, like, oh, I'm like moving train kind of thing, which is quite interesting. But this is called type of visual motion task. And then from the decision-making point of view, the task is to tell us what is the direction of the motion, okay? Or is there coherent motion? Is it left or is it right? For example, in the example that's coming up. So that's what the so this is work from, it's actually in Wolfram Gerstner's book, which is you can find at this location. So that's the kind of psychological part. There's also we see this type of thing in the brain. So they're called directionally selective cells in the kind of higher order part of the visual cortex, area MT. So it's kind of motion area of visual cortex. So in macaques in particular, there's been a lot of work on essentially like recording activity of neurons and then characterizing something called a tuning curve conditioned on the motion direction. Okay, so the idea is that you present the stimuli that I just described. They're moving in this direction, they're moving in this direction, they're more or less coherent. So these would be different directions, these would be different levels of coherence. And then you pick some cell in this brain area, which is, it's not a tiny brain area, but it's like not the biggest brain area either. So, but there's a lot of cells there. And look at the firing rate of that cell with respect to a kind of parameterized definition of these different stimulus types, right? So the angle is the one I'm showing here. And basically, you'll find a lot of neurons that have a directional selectivity, and again, what we call a tuning curve that looks something like this, where they particularly want to see movement going this way, or actually they might also want to see just angles at this orientation, although that's more of an early visual cortex thing. But they particularly want to see, in this case, like movement going in a certain angle, and then the ones that are the angles that are kind of further away from their preference, they still respond to, but they respond to less, following some kind of Gaussian distribution around a preferred orientation, right? So this is called this type of thing in general, where we've got some firing rate as a function of some parameter, you know, and usually it's a one-dimensional parameter. It's easy to understand when it's just one parameter rather than, you know, more, but this could be a multi-dimensional thing as well. So we have some you know, Gaussian or exponential or some kind of continuous distribution over our stimulus parameter. Okay, tuning curves we'll come back to. Firing rate as a function of the stimulus parameter. So this is for the orientation. Same thing, similar thing for the coherence. So these are examples from actual firing rates of cells in the again, motion part of the visual cortex. The approach, again, coming from psychology, for modeling the decision-making part of this. Okay, so the bit I was telling you just now with the tuning curve, this is just, if you like, the response, the kind of neural response, neural selectivity to a particular type of stimulus information. Yeah. So it's just, so this example would be one neuron, and then I think in a few slides I've got, I'll show you like what the population like extension of that would be, but for now you just think of it as like one neuron. So this is neuron response, and then the decision-making part is, so we've kind of got two parts here. We've got the, you know, seeing the perception, and then the decision-making, being a perceptual decision-making task. So in this example, which is a kind of common example, the options, it's called a two alternative task, where you just have to say, are they moving left or are they moving right? And the type of model that's commonly used for this, as I said, it's called drift diffusion model, is essentially a kind of evidence accumulator, right? So we've got some quantity X, you know, call this like the decision variable, and we have some value of X that we're going to call a decision threshold in one or other direction. So it could be positive or negative in this case. And then we've got so it starts at some point that's like, you know, equidistant between the two. So like 0, say, prior information, and then show the stimulus, okay, and then kind of track forward in time. So what's going on over here is you get your kind of the information about the stimulus is coming in. You're kind of getting additional information over this period. It's accumulating, okay, but it's also noisy. So initially, just in this example here, that there's, as you see, this kind of fluctuation in this direction, but that was, if you like, a kind of noisy fluctuation. And then eventually the correct decision is that they were moving right. And then we have this kind of drift towards the decision threshold. And then that happens at a certain time. And then what the aim of this is to do, as I was saying earlier on, is to give us a model of reaction times and error rates. Okay. So the reaction time is like, when did they respond? Okay. And then, but the model point of that would be like when our X passes our decision threshold, one way or another. Okay. And then the error rate would be like, well, did it do the left or the right? Did it pass the left or the right one threshold point? And then that would tell you whether it was correct or incorrect. And then that would be one trial. Okay. And then what we're looking for is typically like a distribution of the times of the response times and the error rates over some set of trials that has some kind of fluctuation, some variation of some stimulus category in them. And then what this is giving us is that, so the terms in the model, we've got the drift and the diffusion part, so our A and our C. And the idea is that we've got two things going on. We've got the evidence accumulation, so the actual data, if you like, the information that matters about the stimulus. And then we've got also some uncertainty or some noise. And the uncertainty and the noise is the thing that gives us variability, or allows us to sort of parameterize a part of the decision-making process that gives us some variability here, some variability in the time at which we both the reaction time and the error rate. So depending on this kind of the parameters we get here, we can get, you know, fast and consistent decisions. We can get fast and inconsistent decisions, so on and so forth. So this kind of accommodates a variety of different data kind of distributions that we get with this broad family tasks, perceptual decision making being one of the types of tasks that kind of fits into. There are others, but that's the one that we're kind of talking about here. So that was just a relatively brief just pointer to the drift diffusion model. And that was our kind of model one for thinking about these type of modeling decision making kind of in the brain, but also at a behavioral level. There's some limitations here with the drift diffusion model. One of them is that it's kind of by construction, as I said, it's the example I just showed there only really accommodates two decisions, like left or right in that case. Doesn't really work well for kind of arbitrary numbers of decisions, and doesn't necessarily work for things that aren't sort of geometrically opposite. Excuse me. So that's one of the, say, limitations of drift diffusion model. Another one is it doesn't kind of explicitly incorporate something that we might want to incorporate, which is some parameterization of the reliability of our sensory estimates. Okay, so another second family of models, broad family of models in, again, cognitive psychology, but send into neuroscience, is called Bayesian decision, Bayesian brain or Bayesian decision-making models. They're really just straight up Bayesian inference. So there's nothing going to be kind of surprising to you if you've seen a little bit about Bayesian inference from time to time, which I'm sure most people here have. But we'll talk through an example of how these kind of things are used in computational neuroscience. So here is some work reviewed by Puget on multisensory integration. So multisensory integration, broadly speaking, is when you have some task, some decision, perhaps, or just a perceptual categorization, where you have information coming from multiple sensory modalities. Okay, so vision, touch, haptic, auditory. I don't think you can easily have interoceptive stimulation, but somatosensory. So there's a few ways you can kind of add information from multiple senses together. So multi-sensory integration tasks are pretty interesting from a neuroscience point of view, because you're kind of requiring certain parts of the brain to communicate with each other, and often they're quite large parts of the brain that are quite far away from each other. So there's a certain kind of structural part of multisensory integration tasks that requires like a network level systemic organization on the brain side. And there's interesting things that follow from that. But this is just a minimal example. So this is some work from Ernst & Banks quite a while back now. It's visual and haptic. So visual and, haptic is like, what haptic is touch of the hand, right? Yeah. So the task is to figure out how long is this bar that's kind of in front of you, and you can see it and you can feel it with your hand. So those are the two pieces of sensory evidence that are being combined here. So a bar of width W, and the task is to estimate what the width is given a haptic measurement. You're allowed to feel it, and a visual measurement, you're allowed to look at it. And the interesting thing is how those are combined. So there's a few ways you could go about this. If you just break it down, like the simplest one would be, and the question here is now, how do you combine, given that you have some estimate from your haptic and some estimate from your visual, what's the best way of combining them? So the simple one, which is kind of obviously not the right one, is to just average them. But the obvious problem with that is that you're giving like an equal weight to both modalities, which might not be right. It might not be appropriate, might not be, I mean, basically vision, you're better at vision than touch and haptic sensory processing as a member of the Homo sapiens species, but there might be other contexts where you have limited information in one domain where that switches around, but it's really going to be just like equal weighted average. So then the second option, which makes sense, is weight things according to something like their reliability, right? And in the kind of Bayesian context, then what we've got here is, say, we're trying to find the some posterior estimate of the thing we're interested in, which is the width of the bar, given an estimate from these two pieces of information, from the visual and the haptic. So we have our posterior likelihood of the measurement given the actual width. We have priors. In this case, I think the priors are flat, but the priors could be non-flat. And this is what we're aiming for: a posterior distribution on the width given both of these pieces of information. So in this case, we want to combine some estimates that we've got from both of these modalities, from V and from T, to give us the posterior distribution given both V and T. If we consider these, as we often do with Bayesian inference, to be Gaussians and maybe normalized Gaussians, then combining probability distributions is kind of straightforward. We just multiply two normal distributions, and we get another Gaussian out of it. That's like the beautiful thing about Gaussian stuff. With Bayes is we kind of put Gaussians in, multiply Gaussians, get Gaussians out, Gaussian, 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 okay? And there's some, and we can even have some kind of simple scalar equations for the parameters of this distribution, given the parameters of these distributions, so we don't even have to do any kind of like full numerical integration to compute the mixtures of Gaussian distributions. But the general idea is that we're going to have some weighting between the two, but some weighting on the means and some updated precision or standard deviation that will have two properties. One, and again, this is just kind of straight Bayesian inference, but the interesting thing here is the fact that this is like what's been observed consistently in neuroscience studies on these type of experiments, is that we can see this in decision making, we can see this in neural response properties, we can see like the brain behaving like a Bayesian inference machine, where in this example I want to point to here, there's kind of 2 points really. So we've got the estimate of the from the haptic, okay, the blue one, got the estimate from the visual, which is the yellow one. The difference between these two differences between these two, one is that their means are different. The peak of this and the peak of this are in different locations, different widths, and their variances are different. The blue one has got a larger variance than the yellow one. But when we combine them, so our kind of joint estimate, our combined estimate is this purple one here, and this is in a fairly intuitive way, I think, like a combination and an average of the means of these two, but that's weighted by their respective precision in a way that it's actually preferring or prioritizing the visual one here, the yellow one, because the precision, the yellow one has a higher precision. So there's more preference being given to the the more reliable sensory estimate than the less reliable sensory estimate, which is the blue ones, less reliable because it's like shorter and fatter. And then the final thing is that the endpoint, which is the updated like joint distribution, also has a tighter, a higher precision or a lower variance, which in this context means it's kind of thinner and taller. Okay, so and that is also kind of intuitive, like in the sense of what we're doing here is we've combined multiple sources of information and reduced our error, which have respective errors associated with them, but we have less error in our estimate as a result, because we've kind of integrated more data in a nutshell. Okay, so there's two, I think, quite general points to say about this family of models and kind of concepts in computational neuroscience, as in the Bayesian inference approach relative to, say, the drift diffusion approach. One is, well, there's just the general mechanics of the equations and so on, but there's an additional thing that's kind of buried in all of this. Well, not so much buried, I think it's quite explicit, but is that the representations themselves are representations of distributions. Okay, so I think one of the interesting ideas here is that yes, there's the Bayesian inference, maybe the optimal inference, giving us our posterior, given the information that's coming in, but the idea that the kind of underlying structure of the information representation is itself probabilistic, right? That's one of that kind of bigger ideas here in the Bayesian inference approach, right? So instead of representing a specific value, neurons implement a probability distribution over that value, okay? And by doing that allows neurons to kind of simultaneously have their representation of the value itself, but also encode variability in a way that it can kind of optimally make use of variable levels of certainty in the task at hand. Okay, so that was fairly high level, but if we drill down, or if we spend a bit more time on that, then there's a lot of work in both of those two areas, both of those two, say, computational frameworks for thinking about decision making, perceptual decision making, but it wasn't really it wasn't particularly aimed towards neuroscience from a neuroscience point of view. We talked a little bit about recordings in macaques and so on, but most of what I've told you up to this point is again kind of coming from essentially from psychology. So let's go a little bit further and think about this in terms of some of the things that we think about and we've talked about a little bit already from the neuron coding point of view. So there's two parts to the problem here of neurons doing decision making, I guess. I'm going to break it down to encoding and decoding. Okay, so encoding, thinking about how sensory inputs are mapped onto these probability distributions, as I was just describing, onto these neural response profiles. And then the decoding part is how are they read out? So it's the reading off. So read by higher areas to perform computations and inference. The decoding is also to some extent like how they're read by us. Okay, so this is more to do with like what we can see when we're looking at data, and what information we can see kind of in the measurements about what the kind of computations are doing. So classic type of neural response profile for the first part of these for encoding actually goes back to Hubel and Wiesel, who had the Nobel Prize for kind of discovering orientation selectivity in ants and frogs, I think, back in the 50s. Anyway, work for it's going on a long time. Have identified that there are neurons in the visual cortex that have directional selectivity. So this is a little bit simpler than the motion selectivity that I showed you a few slides back, but it's in the same family. So rather than there being neurons that kind of fire when they see motion in a certain direction, there's neurons actually earlier in the visual stream that fire when they see things they see something pointed at a certain angle that they prefer. And the thing is like just a bar of black shade on a kind of white background. So, and this is another example of tuning. Okay, so this is this general concept that I introduced earlier. So think about tuning in this context as the directional selectivity of the firing of single neurons with respect to some property, some parameter that in this case, again, is the angle, okay, the orientation of the bar, and we get this tuning curve, right? So the preferred orientation, and as you move away, then we get drop off, and it typically does actually have some Gaussian shape. So the thing that we're thinking about here now is a firing rate. Okay, we could be looking at other quantities, but the typical quantity that we're thinking about when we're thinking about tuning curves is a neural firing rate. And similarly to the drift diffusion model and just things we were talking about before, and also previous lectures as well, we think about this firing rate as being a combination of some computation, if you like, this directionally selective tuning curve, and some noise. Okay, so Fi is a tuning curve of a neuron in a population of n neurons, and then we have some trial to trial varying observation noise. So then these tuning properties, you know, so here's one of these tuning curves again. We've seen this a few times, and then I said I would follow up with the question that came along before. So this would be for one neuron, and then with a mean, the kind of yellow line in the middle, and then some variance, standard deviation for each point, for each value of the orientation that we're kind of querying it over. And then this, it's on the left, and then on the right, these would be if we take the mean of several neurons and just plot them out. And this is kind of schematic. But this is this point about, so there'll be several neurons in, and typically, for example, in the visual cortex with orientation selectivity, and orientation selectivity is interesting. You have like quite a complicated arrangement of like zones of orientational selectivity going all the way up the visual system. There's these things called pinwheels that kind of tessellate. It gets interesting and quite difficult to understand, to be honest. But there's a lot of orientation selectivity going on in the visual cortex in a nutshell. But you go to any given area, you'll find some neurons that they like this orientation, some that like this orientation, some that like this orientation. So that's what we're just kind of representing here with the, you know, this thick line, but for several individual cells over like in some part of the brain. Okay, so have some firing rate, this function of tuning curve, some noise. Now the tuning curve is going to be some statistical distribution. As I've said, I've talked about Gaussians so far. We are going to keep talking about Gaussians, but we could also use something like a von Mises distribution for orientation selectivity, which kind of makes sense a little bit more because von Mises distribution is a statistical distribution defined over a circle. But we're going to stick with Gaussians. So, and again, we're thinking here now about spikes, but but rates of spikes, firing rates. Okay, so we did cover earlier on. I appreciate we didn't cover it in as much detail as some other things, but we did cover Poisson neuron models that are basically saying, giving us a minimal formalism for saying we have some Poisson process now. So the kind of firing our neuron is a Poisson process that's defined by our in this case now our tuning curve. You know, as a function of our stimulus, right? So S will be our orientation here, I would be our neuron index, okay? And the linear nonlinear Poisson neuron is basically giving us an expression for like the number of spikes that we're going to see over a certain amount of time, which is it's kind of the exponential term here is kind of giving us telling us what the drop off is going to be in our kind of firing rate over a period of time, and we're going to kind of think about this now from the point of view of some tuning curve that's going to be telling us what's the probability of getting a certain firing rate given our stimulus value, so our stimulus value S. Okay, so that was Poisson distribution. As I said, we're kind of actually going to be thinking about Gaussians. We can just swap a Gaussian distribution in for Poisson distributions in a certain context, you know. So there's a we can give parameters for Gaussian and Poisson distributions where they basically look the same, and then again what we're looking for here is like the combination of the trial by trial noise and the tuning and the tuning curve properties. So that was kind of start thinking about the individual neurons, and then what we often then want to do is kind of scale this up to a population, kind of group of neurons in some patch of tissue that we're recording from. So the kind of simple way of treating this is just to say, you know, just apply probability theory. Say, so we've got some set of independent neurons that are in some patch of tissue that are responding independently, and so the population response distribution here, so P for like over all of our neurons up to R 1 up to N. We were indexing these with I before, is going to be the product of the population responses for all of them. You know, notate this with the Kronecker delta usual way. And so this is kind of how we can summarize the population response, a population encoding response function for a set of independent kind of tuning curve defined Poisson neurons. There is a way of kind of extending this out with spikes, which we can kind of go into, but I don't have much more to say about that right now. Okay, so that was just kind of a skim through the elements of the first part of the problem, if you like, of like how do we think about the job of neurons for kind of capturing information processing for things like decision making, encoding. So second part is going to be decoding. So this is now we can think about a few different approaches to this, kind of strategies, if you like, on the neuron side. Like we kind of talked about earlier with the ways of combining different types of sensory information. So like two that are simple ones that first come to mind would be just take the strongest response, or the argmax of our firing rate. So the neuron that fires the most, we'll consider that to be the one that's giving us the right answer. Another one that would be similar to how we were combining our probability distributions before would be kind of take just the weighted average of the entire firing rate of the firing rate preferences. Sorry, the preferences of all the neurons in our population. Just do a weighted sum, kind of equally weighted sum here. So those would be kind of non-probabilistic approaches, and then probabilistic approaches that are like in the space of actually making use of the probability distributions that we've been mostly framing this around. We could use something called a maximum likelihood decoder, where we kind of define this as a maximum likelihood, and then we're looking for the max arg over this likelihood function, or our Bayesian decoder. Okay, so then again, following similar approach than we were thinking about before, so just kind of using Bayes' rule to combine the likelihoods with our priors, if we have a prior, to get a potentially more, or indeed fully optimal estimate of the stimulus given the kind of sensory input and given our prior as well. Okay, so those are kind of strategies for doing decoding. A few slides here about decoding performance. These are kind of methods for evaluating the numbers that you get with those approaches. Don't really want to go into the details of those. So let's look at some examples of this and just kind of work it through. One isn't really a neuroscience example. This is just a kind of conceptual example to get a point across about averaging. And I said earlier, I did one revision to the slides to update them, which is I swapped the picture of Justin Trudeau out for this one here. But the example here is, say, so we've got some polling company to say, tell us what you think who you think's going to win the election, do that over time, and then we get company A does this with a sample of 900 people, company B does this with a sample of 100 people. How can we combine this information, right? So the suboptimal example would be to just equally weight those two. The optimal one would be to scale that by their reliability, which in this case is exactly their sample sizes. And the end point of this is just demonstrated in this figure here. So the point being, like, you get more variability if you were to follow this through, and this is kind of using some kind of simulated polling data, but polling data that is, I think, realistically simulated, is that you get a tighter and essentially more accurate estimate when you do the Bayes, the proportionally weighted, than the suboptimal combination of the information here, right? The yellow ones are just moving around more. So that's an example to get your kind of intuition going. So we can follow this through in a neuroscience context. So this is some work from Beck et al. From a while back. And this is a model, a kind of simple neural visual spatial decoding model, kind of image processing. But the point from carrying on from the previous example with the optimal and the suboptimal averaging was to get across this idea of an optimal or a suboptimal filter. which is what was done here. So the objective is to kind of classify the I think the orientation, perhaps the spatial frequency of the image. And then the comparison here is to kind of add in before the classification step, before the neuron that's seeing this, or the neural network that's seeing this, I should say, a filter that is conducive to the problem of identifying the stimulus properties, or one that's not. So an optimal or suboptimal filter, and then repeat that for multiple trials. And then the point, the kind of ultimate point is that, so the optimal filter was, I guess, around here, right, where there's like zero information loss. And but suboptimal filters can be kind of quite problematic in terms of their impact on the decision making computation here. So that observation, an interesting part of that observation, is summarized in this slide here. So this is with just as a function in this model, a function of the number of neurons that are doing the image classification, and the variance in the response for a few different types of, if you like, noise, right? Well, yeah, noise types, ones that are kind of additive at the final point. So some measurement noise, basically, some internal process noise. And then the key thing is this, that the suboptimal inference, right, which in the schematic example here, this was just like choosing the wrong filter, is actually worse than various kinds of actual noise that you can, characterize in this model. So the point is, like, a suboptimal weighting scheme can be highly more problematic than you might expect in terms of its impact on coding performance, at least in terms of how that's been analyzed in this work here. Okay, so we're kind of wrapping up, nearly done on the intro lecture here, actually. So we're going to wrap up, I think, last example now on multisensory integration. So this is more or less a repeat of some of the points we're making earlier on. Different study this time from Ma et al. But it's multisensory integration. Okay, so the same kind of task. We've got some cues that are coming from a auditory information, some that are coming from visual information. The actual task is to tell me, like, what's the position, like, where is the sound coming from? Or sorry, where is the stimulus coming from? So there's some visual information and there's some auditory information. It's one of these kind of rooms that you can set up with speakers at multiple locations, so that and also a screen as well. So they can kind of have sound, have stimuli come from different locations, and then you have the auditory information and you have the visual information to go on, and it's kind of in a position relative to where the person sat. So that's kind of the context here, and the goal is to obtain an estimate of the stimulus position, and also the reliability of the estimate based on the inputs from the two populations. So kind of coming back to the tuning curve, so you can think about this as a combination, as a problem of taking a bunch of Poisson neurons defined with these Gaussian shaped tuning curves, and the tuning curves are identical Gaussians in this case. And then again, what the job here is to multiply a bunch of independent probability distributions just like this. And if we kind of work that through with the equation for the Poisson neuron, then we have a kind of this form for the tuning curve of the population in this context. And then the job is to combine those. Okay. So combine, given like our firing rate, our firing rate for our auditory stimulus, given our sensory stimulus orientation, same for visual, pass through the Bayesian decoder. So the Bayesian decoder is kind of giving us the equation to kind of compute this posterior, given the firing rates that we're kind of seeing as a function of the measured stimuli, and the multisensory integration part again. So we kind of got the job of, we've got our auditory and our visual separately. Okay, so our tuning curve for our auditory, our tuning curve for our visual. So we're combining those. We need to multiply them. We had the long form of the equations for these here. So we're going to kind of got a multiplication of two of these big Kronecker delta products, which is going to give us another big Kronecker delta product. And this is going to give us the tuning curve that combines our auditory and our visual information for this sensory stimulus location in this case. So the general approach, so the kind of upshot here, similarly when we were thinking about this from the earlier multisensory example, is that when we're thinking about Poisson neuron population activity patterns that are statistically independent, then what we're kind of dealing with is a multiplication of the probability distributions that are encoding in those respective patterns for those different neuron sensory modality populations. Okay. So last point, and this is kind of a footnote more or less, but it's kind of a qualifying comment on the rationale for, or like kind of methodology for how we were thinking about getting these big multi-population joint distribution estimates. They were all assuming that things are independent. Okay, so that's why I had a bunch of products of a bunch of probabilities. We do have a certain amount of background correlation in neural activity measurements. So particularly thinking about about firing rates. So the kind of reported range of these it's small. So it's like a kind of 0.1, 0.15 background correlation in firing rates, just between any kind of recording that you're making at any given time. So they're kind of mostly independent, but not entirely independent. So this is a small background correlation. Okay, that's what. So this is the kind of correlation distribution here. So just centered around 0.1. Okay. Now, so it's a small background correlation, but turns out that if you do have a small amount of background correlation, like 0.12 here, and then you, I mean, in this example, so this is kind of study kind of looking at the discrimination performance in a model with a large number of neurons. For like a 0 level of background correlation or a relatively modest level of background correlation, then you actually get a drop-off in the Fisher information or like a decoding performance. So a kind of how to say ceiling, and that kicks in, way before mean, I think there is a limit on the blue line here, but you get limits that kick in, some ceilings that kick in on the amount of information that a system, a population of neurons can represent if they have some background correlation level. And the implication here, the suggestion is that this means that there's like an upper limit on the level of discrimination, performance, encoding, computation, etc. That neurons and like humans can actually do when they have a certain amount of background correlation. So we shouldn't expect to be kind of always doing really well, or also these models to be doing really well in the presence of modest levels of background correlations. And but that's like just a kind of caveat point we'll leave there for now. So yeah, the kind of final just wrap up point, everything we've talked about so far has been, broadly speaking, I mean, we've shown these kind of abstract types of cognitive models, drift diffusion models. We've talked about encoding and decoding with tuning curves and firing rates that are kind of giving us some equations for some types of statistical distribution. But all of this is still, even the kind of Poisson neurons, that they're all like kind of fairly phenomenological, not very kind of mechanistically implemented in terms of like how are those computations actually happening in the biophysical circuitry of the components of the system. So that's something that's, an open question. That's another big area of computational neuroscience in this field, that if you wanted to go further on the kind of neuroscience of like neural coding and probabilistic inference in brain circuits, then you would come to this question of implementation, right? In other words, like, how are the neurons doing this, right? They're not doing Bayes' rule in terms of like how in the way that a computer does it when you code it in whatever way you code it algorithmically, or probably in the way that you're doing it as a, say, kind of cognitive agent from the point of view of like how you reason it through mathematically. Like a neuron doing something that looks like Bayes optimal encoding and decoding has got to be implementing that with some set of some operation on its inputs, okay, that is capitalizing on some combination of things that we still don't entirely know. So it could be the like network structure that's leading in. Okay, so for example, when we're talking about tuning curves and response selectivity, and like there's neurons that respond to an orientation of this or a visual motion of this and so on. There's something that's in the background here, which is what that is saying experimentally and literally is that we've put say a recording electrode in the visual cortex in a certain location, and then we show some stimuli, and then we show some stimuli at different angles, and then we get firing rates at different angles, okay? And then we say this neuron has a tuning curve and an orientational selectivity and a response preference to this type of stimulus, okay? But that neuron isn't like connected to that stimulus, right? And at that level of description, that neuron is kind of in the ether, right? What's really going on is that neuron's getting a lot of inputs, right? And those inputs, even if it's in just the early visual cortex, go back quite a long way. If you think about like from the retina is quite a complicated neural circuit in the first place. And then you go through the, like thalamus, a few other steps of the visual cortex before you get to even like a neuron in V1, which is more or less the first part of the visual cortical pathway. if you think about MT, which we were talking about with the visual motion, that's about like 3 or 4 like brain areas up. Could be, I mean, it could be like 2 synapses, but it could be like 50 synapses, as in like intermediate steps of neuron to neuron to neuron between the kind of orientational, the firing rate that you're seeing, say, in the neuron that you're recording in area MT, and the visual stimulus kind of incident on the retina, let's say. So there's a neural network, right? A kind of hierarchy of steps that's led to the tuning curve that you're seeing, the response profile that you're seeing of a neuron at any given point in the brain, even at relatively like low level, say like sensory cortices, for example, but certainly anywhere above low level sensory cortices. So there's got to be something underneath that. So when I'm saying like what is the implementation of the coding scheme here and the implementation of the Bayesian inference, for example, at some level, like it has to be something about networks, right? It has to be something about this prior, quite hard to nail down, but probably ultimately quite complicated polysynaptic set of paths that have led to you seeing a firing rate in the place where you're recording it as a function of some interesting stimulus feature. Okay, so that's like one level of implementation. Another level of implementation, which is not mutually exclusive to just thinking about, say, chains of neurons, is the structure of the dendrites. So this is quite a hot topic in this part of the world. I mean, but in this field as well, which is that the dendritic tree, so the morphology of the neuron, is actually doing something kind of analogous to what I was describing just now about the previous, if you like, network layer steps leading up to the one that you're measuring, but kind of at a cellular level, or sorry, a subcellular level. So you have rather than it being kind of neuron to neuron to neuron to neuron leading to the one you're reading a firing rate off, it's like this input come into this part of the dendritic tree, propagate down, propagate down, propagate down, eventually it comes to the soma, and that's what generates the firing rate response. So there's like a hierarchical prior processing step for a single neuron that is integrating information, that is its input, its kind of set of inputs on its dendrites, right? Just an individual neuron. And the morphological structure, that kind of like complex tree organization that is just part of the like cellular composition of neurons, does appear to have some computational properties that are quite interesting, and even potentially things like back propagation can, as in like literally like backprop of the kind that's in neural network algorithms. But backpropagation is also a word that describes when activity moves from the soma towards the dendrites, which is something that is not usually the direction. That's not the kind of classic definition, direction of flow that we think about with neurons. We think about neurons as being like information comes in on the dendrites, and then it kind of basically propagates down into, it kind of filters down the tree, reaches the cell body, and then the cell body integrates all of that information, then fires a certain rate, decides what to do. There is actually kind of a bit of a back and forth if you take a very close look at what certain neurons are doing, especially in like pyramidal cells that are quite long and complex and large and complex. Like they have things like back propagating calcium spikes, where you have basically activity goes down the tree, but it also sometimes can go kind of in at the middle and go back up in both directions. And there's kind of volleys. So there's a lot of kind of network structure, even at the single cell level, that probably contributes to some of the kind of computational properties of neurons that we really don't understand well, and I certainly don't understand very well, but that's something there's a lot of interest in. Yeah, in addition to the kind of, if you like, larger network mechanism of like multiple cells. And then in both of these cases, but particularly with the network case, there's going to be like a learning aspect to it as well. Like a so how do we arrive at these structures? How do we arrive at the kind of set of weights, if you like, through a combination of networks, and I guess to some extent like the weights in the implicit in the dendritic tree that lead to the neural implementation of certain coding decoding schemes. Like, these are open questions, very open questions, but very interesting questions in neuroscience more broadly. So there's a lot of interesting stuff that you like reading. We've got a few examples of some kind of additional reading people want to check out. Bayesian just so stories is a kind of bit of a trope at this point, but the idea that this is kind of speaking to, by the way, this trope about just so stories, it's something that comes up in psychology quite often. So it's something that comes in like evolutionary psychology before this as well. I think the idea behind like Bayesian just so stories to some extent is like you can see things that look like quite smart coding schemes in a lot of like, it's potentially quite easy to kind of fool yourself into thinking that there's something smart going on when actually there's not. Maybe that's the best way of summarizing what's going on there. Like, you do have to have like appropriate kind of null model on a hypothesis about a certain kind of coding mechanism that is taking into account the ways in which you could kind of use other properties of information in the, let's say, the experimental protocol, experimental paradigm context that can like give you the information that you need without having to do anything that's particularly smart or Bayes optimal or anything like that. So these are kind of pushback, I guess, that you can kind of find some interesting commentaries on in the literature as well. By the way, the Griffiths here is not me. There's other people with my name who know more about this stuff than I do. Yeah, so just kind of wrap up on the lecture. We'll take a break. We'll go to the tutorial as usual. So we've got cognitive models of perception decision making, just a high level survey. We talked about drift diffusion models and Bayesian inference models. This is one of the things we've been thinking about here today, right? The brain as a probabilistic inference machine. And it does certainly seem to be the case that encoding uncertainty, particularly, making use of reliability or precision of different types of information is something that like makes sense and is something that the brain does. And the job for us is trying to understand like what are the properties of that and how does it work. But there's a lot of interesting things going on here. Encoding, decoding, okay, optimal, suboptimal. What is the role of noise? We just kind of touched on that. We've got more on noise in the next lecture, more from a dynamics point of view, but also from a coding point of view. And as I said, there's a lot of open questions here around like the implementation, which is a different type of question than the coding scheme or the kind of mechanics of the integration of probability distributions. But there's kind of an interesting, that would be an example. So my final point there about what is the neural implementation, right? This would be the type of thing that is like spanning the explanatory gap in my first slide, right? Like we have these interesting kind of statistical coding properties that we can see in data, and we can kind of formulate phenomenological models of. What are the neural mechanisms that are implementing those, right? That's like a holy grail type question. That's active area of research in this field. Cool. Okay. So that's it for our intro lecture. I'll take questions from the room and from the call, and then we'll take a 10-minute break.
I did something like a project I did in a previous class, and we had to break down and research one of these papers. It was called the hierarchical error reduction model, HER model. I might be messing it up.
Okay.
And it kind of touched upon some of the ideas we're talking about, but from like a reinforcement learning perspective, where I think sometimes they also in cognitive science call it predictive processing or predictive coding or something like that.
Yeah.
Where it's kind of this recursive, very much so hierarchical filtering of error reduction, like attempt error reduction, and then like continuously do that.
Yeah.
Wonder, yeah, where does like the idea of kind of like pseudo reinforcement learning, predictive coding, HER model kind of fall into what we talked about today?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think I feel bad now you mention it for not making that clear, because it fits in kind of throughout, and so kind of regurgitate some of what you said just now. You know, we've been thinking about, or it's giving a few kind of survey examples of you know, contexts where there's some cognitive task, some kind of classification task, and then there's information from here and information from there. But it's been, although I did mention that, you know, any neuron firing any part of the brain has got a lot going on, but like leading up to it firing. But broadly speaking, I've been talking about things that are kind of lateral to each other, let's say, broadly speaking, rather than hierarchically organized. And yeah, a big part, particularly I think in the last kind of 5-10 years in computational neuroscience in this space, has been around this question of like predictive coding, as you're saying. And so predictive coding is like one of the buzzwords, or the kind of substitute, the general terms for a general kind of perspective on brain function and coding in the brain that's along the lines of the brain elements, or brain, like people as cognitive agents, whatever level you want to pose it at, is our kind of operating environment where we have priors, we have, you know, tasks, jobs, like classification tasks, whatever, cognitive functions, and there's a kind of time element to it. So this is just kind of happening dynamically, right? I'm expecting a lot, or I have like a rich prior landscape of what I think is going on when I walk into a room, or when I close my eyes, or when I don't do anything in particular. And that's all kind of there at the start. And then the kind of sensory information comes in to, it kind of adjusts the balance, if you like, weighted more towards the priors would be maybe one way of thinking about that. So, and then the kind of hierarchical part to that, which is, you know, part of your question as well, is you know, so also relating to, as I was saying, like the kind of priors being to some extent more important than the likelihoods or the sensory information. The idea with or one of the kind of key ideas with like hierarchical predictive coding is that the error signals are the things that really matter, right? So it's the mismatch between the times when you have like a mismatch between your kind of prediction of what you're going to see, for example, and what you see. Those are like the high information events, right? And that's like the what the brain's kind of looking for. So it's looking more for the for like mismatches than it is for congruences, because those are that's where the kind of additional information is. So yeah, I mean, in terms of like the hierarchical part to that, so I would say there's just like a lot of things, there's a few kind of lines of work that take this at different points. So the tricky thing is like, how do you define the hierarchy? Okay, so a simple answer to that is to say, well, it starts at the sensory cortex and then it goes up to the association cortex and then it ends up at the frontal cortex, and you can kind of broadly define a hierarchy on the cortex. That like maybe you can say, okay, here's like point 1, point 2, point 3, and I'm going to say, well, my hierarchy then is going to be a 3-level hierarchy where I've taken this bit here, this bit here, this bit here, and then the model in that case has got, you know, broadly speaking, like high-level priors over here, feeding into mid-level priors over here, or sorry, high-level representation of thing in environment, keep it general, right? And then like mid-level representation here, low-level representation here. And then the thing that the hierarchy is doing some kind of progressive abstraction. And that abstraction can be, it's often kind of smoothed in concept space, smoothed in time. So for example, I mean, in concept space, like a good example of this would be if you look in the visual system as well, and you look in, say, the medial temporal lobe, and you say look at like neuron response profiles and like tuning curves essentially for like what's the kind of axes of the stimulus categorization space way up in the medial temporal lobe, which is more or less like the top of the visual stream, versus the visual cortex. The visual cortex is like, what are the orientations of angles? What are the shapes? So up in the medial temporal lobe, it's like, is it man-made? Is it something I can manipulate? Is it something that is it a tool? These comes from like PCA, like analyses of like neural activity profiles. There's like a few dimensions that things kind of fall on when you go right at the top of the visual stream, and they're not unintuitive, but you wouldn't necessarily know them if you hadn't like read this literature. Like tools are a very like big important part of how we categorize the world. So you're like man-made objects. So the point there being, so that's like a kind of abstraction level that is getting towards a kind of conceptual abstraction level, right? A different type of abstraction level that you have that is kind of used in predictive processing models, as I was saying, is more about time. So it's about kind of time scales of information representation. So broadly speaking, you like the idea is that, I mean, both in like models and in, I think, a lot of neural recording contexts that are trying to kind of flesh this out, is that the temporal, the kind of time window of integration for neurons that are higher up in the hierarchy is longer than the time window of integration neurons lower in the hierarchy. And that's something that makes sense in terms of that kind of hierarchical decision tree predictive coding arrangement. Like you tend to get, just from a kind of dynamics point of view, if you set up like a simple model of some like Langevin equation linear neurons even, or some spiking neurons, like there's lots of ways you can show this. And you kind of set it up in a hierarchy where you have like bidirectional feedback between each level in the hierarchy, then you'll start to get slow frequency stuff at the top of the hierarchy and higher frequency stuff, and you have some information coming in, and that the information coming in is like the fast it is fast. So you kind of generate low frequency time constants essentially when you have some hierarchical like message passing structure, and that's like a property of dynamics, but it also probably is should be thought about as a property of information processing as well. It's like you kind of start coding information that is like spread out over time at the higher end of the hierarchy, or at least like things that have like larger temporal integration windows than the fast event than things at the lower part of the hierarchy. Because at the lower part of the hierarchy, you're like, if you think about it from the point of view of vision, it's like I'm moving around, right? Moving my head. There's a lot of like fast fluctuation in terms of like what the visual system is seeing, what the input to the visual system is. If you think about stimulus, like lower level stimulus properties, but the constants, right? The kind of like abstracted parts of the overall scenario, as I am in a room, right? If you like. So it kind of I think it's also fairly intuitive that there should be a bit of separation of timescales for where the fast stuff is happening at the bottom and the slow stuff is happening at the top, given that in terms of like the primary stimulus features, at least, that's where there's a lot of fast fluctuation happening at the kind of stimulus input layer anyway. So yeah, a few reflections on predictive coding, I guess. If you want to look for work in this area, actually from some colleagues that I work with as well, that's I think you mentioned something similar, that there's a model called a hierarchical Gaussian filter model. There's essentially a kind of like 3-level Bayesian Bayes network graph that has a nice kind of psychological interpretation where you have, it's like beliefs and then volatility and beliefs. There's another word, it's not volatility, but it's like it encapsulates a certain amount, a kind of interesting thing that's relevant in psychiatry actually, which is like how confident you are about your beliefs about the world and how confident you are about your confidence about your beliefs about the world. And you kind of go up like 2 or 3 hierarchies, you can still understand what that kind of corresponds to psychologically. It's kind of it boils down to something like expectation of consistency in the world, essentially, but expectation of consistency in relationships between things, an expectation of consistency in how good your confidence in consistencies and so on. You go like 5 levels, then it's just impossible, but you do like kind of 3 levels of thinking about like what a psychological interpretation of a precision is. You can kind of work with it, and that's got some like concrete applications in psychiatry that are quite interesting.
My teacher that we talked about this in this class, he's like kind of like really die hard about predictive coding. So
Yeah.
The course kind of explored like all of the different ways you could apply it. And I can't remember.
Is that here?
Yeah, his name's Mark Miller.
Okay.
I can't remember specifically his term, what he defines his work to be.
Right.
But it's something along the like something with cognitive science, but I don't know. I can't remember. But yeah, he was saying like one of his interpretations on depression is like how much like happiness is the feeling of like reducing error, and then like depression is like when you can't reduce error. And it's kind of it was a semi-elegant binary way of thinking where it's like you either have error or you have error reduction. And then I think, yeah, like the kind of project that I did, I happened to have found a like very much so computational neuroscience paper that validated kind of these predictive coding, predictive processing thoughts that he had. And it was, like, I didn't really have as much background at the time as I do now, but learning more about it, like, it seemed pretty rigorous. Like, it even had the whole like biochemistry side, with like the error reduction, and saying like, well, there's really strong connections between like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and like the mid-cingulate cortex, and then the front part of your brain is going to make the decision, and then the mid cortex is going to judge it, give it an error. If it's an error, go back, try again. This recursive kind of like pattern in that way. And then, yeah, like the idea of that is kind of, it can be crude, but it can be elegant, and I could say how it can be applicable to like almost every single decision you could probably make. Is just like this philosophy of error reduction. That's all I want to do, and kind of like this reinforcement learning robot kind of way, where it's like it's just trying to walk around, find the minimal error, and then keep doing that.
Yep. So there's that's, like I said, it's a big topic in computational neuroscience. It's but it's one of those things where there's like a school, or there's a movement, or something like that. And I couldn't say I'm in the movement, but I wouldn't say I'm like a detractor, because there are those as well. But there's, so I mean, two other kind of names to float at you. One is my colleague Andrea Diaconescu, who does this kind of thing, focusing on psychosis, and also the suicidality, and they kind of doing some things that you, I think, similar to what you're thinking about there, is you can kind of line up the cognitive and the neural kind of conceptualization of it doesn't even need to be kind of specific tasks. It's actually just like your relationship with the world, that way you kind of point to certain parts of a kind of decision process that relate to confidence in judgments, essentially, or confidence information about judgments that have they can kind of be used as a way of framing some of the cognitive kind of, or putative cognitive issues in complex psychiatric conditions. So check out, Andrea Diaconescu at CAMH, doing fantastic work on that. And that's a good segue into my second point, which is Andrea's from, and I don't think she'll object to me saying this, she's from the Friston School. And so a lot of I think the kind of recent interest in this, but the kind of foundation of this approach in computational neuroscience was given a boost, let's say. I don't want to say came from, but like given a certain boost from a scientist called Carl Friston in the UK from the mid-2000s. And we'll be having Carl in Toronto as the Fields Institute Distinguished Lecturer of 2025, with a 3-lecture series, October 8th, 9th, and 10th, as part of a workshop that we're doing for our thematic program. So if you're interested in this Bayesian brain predictive coding stuff, free energy principle stuff, then Carl is going to be here, and he's going to give like his like full address on that. And I believe it's going to be his last like international talk, because he's retiring. So make sure you're here in October for the Distinguished Lecturer Series. I'm going to go to Shirin's question on the chat. Okay, hi Shirin. So Shirin, you're saying, Professor, I was thinking about how the brain processes sensory inputs, which are continuous like light waves. I love your kind of physics-inspired questions, Shirin. They always have a certain kind of flavor to them, which are continuous like light waves in vision or sound waves in hearing. but at the same time, we seem to perceive and think in discrete categories like objects or words. What do we know about where and how this transition from continuous to discrete happens in the brain? Are there known mechanisms that structure perception into discrete representations? And if I may, also a question about how probabilistic decision-making in the brain compares to AI, whether transformer or diffusion models. Thank you. Okay, Sharon, two excellent questions there. Let me try and do them justice. So the first one was discrete versus continuous. So, I mean, I don't know, I'm guessing from the way you've kind of framed it there that you're kind of just thinking about things and that's kind of come to you, but that is a huge topic in psychology and neuroscience, is like continuous versus discrete, continuity versus discreteness. So you've kind of got your finger on the pulse there, let's say, if that's kind of come to you out the blue. What can we say about that? So, well, one, making use of what we've been talking about here, and if you'll wait while I flash right the way back to the beginning, we had an example of that, right? Which is the drift diffusion model for decision making, and the kind of basic property of this that I think is one of the answers to your question is like thresholds. Okay, so one of the ways in which we can at least understand the presence of categorical categorization, categorical like information processing, is as continuous processes that have one way or another have some kind of like hard or soft threshold, but have thresholds that kind of define the categories. Okay, so in other words, like it's actually continuous, but it appears discrete because there is like a layer that implements a kind of discretization. So that's, I think, it's kind of clear in the drift diffusion model in this minimal context of like deciding between two options. And yeah, there's so many kind of places you could go with this. So one that comes, I just mentioned one because I could talk about this all day. So one that comes to mind is work on representation of space. Okay, and this relates a little bit to what I was saying about what the kind of high-level visual cortex is doing in terms of its what it's representing about the world and what are like the axes of it. So there's some work that the name, if you want to look it up, is Spivey, Spivey. Michael Spivey has a book called, I believe it's called The Continuous Brain. But it's literally, I think the subtitle of it is Continuity and Discreteness in Visual Processing or in Cognition or something like that. So there's at least one like book on this topic that, there you go, I remembered, but I think there's probably like 500. And the example that I'm thinking of from there is so if you set up this, there's some, you can kind of design tasks where you have something that's not actually dissimilar to, I guess, the left-right decision kind of task here in this example on the screen, right? This example was like perceptual motion. But you can set up tasks where you have something like what would be a good example? Large and small. I think anything on a continuum. So there's lots of examples of this. And then the trick is that you kind of give the way that the participant kind of gives the responses, you kind of put that out in space. So like the say large is here and small is here. Okay, So you can kind of show basically that there's a number of kind of abstract cognitive, abstract stimulus categories that if you set them up, set a task structure up, then they'll kind of be represented in a kind of Euclidean geometry, like a 1D or a 2D geometry, where you'll do something like associate one end of the space with high and the other end of the space with low, or one end of the space with bad and one end of the space with good. So those are things that are I guess it's a slightly different point than the one you're making about discreteness and continuity. It's a point about kind of you can kind of get people responding to tasks to kind of take abstract concepts and put them onto a spatial, they kind of naturally transfer abstract concepts onto spatial layouts. I think I kind of butchered that example, but I'll leave it there rather than trying to keep going on it. But it's a great question. Let's just go with that one. Check out Michael Spivey to get a better example of that. So your second question was how the probabilistic decision making in the brain compares to AI and transform and diffusion models. Yeah, how does it compare to AI? So I mean, this is another very hot topic, I think, in current computational neuroscience. I mean, it's as you can imagine, got a big boost from the big boost in AI in general over the past 10 years or so. So what the way that work in this field tends to go, I would say, is there's kind of maybe two basic types. One is, say, I'm kind of measuring activity in the brain. Often it's actually at different locations in the brain, often on some hierarchy, like a visual hierarchy, cognitive hierarchy. So this is easy to do in neuroimaging, but it's something you can do with different types of neuroscience data as well. And you say, okay, how does this compare? How do these brain activity measurements compare to a certain type of hierarchically organized deep neural network? Okay. And then the way that that kind of work goes is to say, well, here's my ML model that's kind of schematically designed to mirror the general organization of, say, the visual system or the kind of hierarchical structure of the cortex. And then I've got some, and then I want to kind of go to one of the locations in that system, like one of the parts of the hierarchy, and take a look at what the profiles, what's going on there. So what's going on there could be like, what is the if you kind of take the units in some intermediate layer and kind of summarize the statistical properties of their responses with respect to the kind of stimulus inputs that you're giving at the input layer, then how are those kind of laying out? What is their dimensionality? What are their like principal components? How do they look like on like a UMAP, right? Like do some analysis, kind of, if you like, kind of almost like explainable AI type analysis on the response properties, like the activation profiles of the neurons within some way that you then want to associate that to something that you're also seeing in the brain for some analogous process, right? So that's one of the ways in which this kind of work we're talking about, but just, I guess, computational neuroscience in general is like working with and kind of riffing off of developments in machine learning, And the aim there would be, broadly speaking, to say like, well, we'll try and find some similarities, emergent similarities in it could be like an ML model, like a deep net that's like very like modularly designed intentionally to very closely reflect a certain like brain pathway, or it could be something a little bit more general that's just like, AlexNet, right? And it's just okay, just use like a standard, something that's not like designed as a brain, but still, if you look in the middle, then there's some like analogous structure in the weights of the neurons there, or the responses of the neurons there, than if you look at like the analogous location in a brain, right? So I think that's my answer to your question. Like, how does this work compare to work in AI? Like, there's work to say we want to like find similarities. To some extent, there's some work trying to say do better AI based on neuroscience, but I don't think that's necessarily of much interest to most of the people who are trying to like push the frontiers in AI. Like, it's probably not like in the leading edge of like where innovations are coming from. So I think the direction of travel is a little bit more like we're potentially learning some new things about brain organization by taking a look at some pretty smart neural networks, rather than learning something about how to build better neural networks than by looking at the brain, unfortunately, I guess, potentially from the neuroscience point of view. That could change, but I think that's the current lay of the land. Yeah.
I feel like that's a big reason I even took this course as well, because I have a really big background coming from machine learning.
Yeah.
And I think what I've noticed, because I've looked into this question a lot, is that the techniques that we use, the machine learning community is more fixated on getting better models and getting better answers with a fixed amount of data. So kind of analogous to what you said before, it's like, does the brain actually do this Bayesian inference kind of thing? Well, if you think that's crazy, there's crazy nonlinear optimization techniques that will take in the machine learning community just to get the best answer. And then to say, does a human brain do that? Probably not. And so the thing is, it's like,
and does the neural network do that?
Yeah.
No, right.
But it works nicely if we have code and linear algebra, and we can do these nonlinear or convex optimization problems. And then if you try and apply that, if you were to try and just model what a brain does, you're not going to get, at least with the tools we have right now, the same kind of optimal answers with this fixed amount of data as these like crazy optimization techniques, or even algorithmic techniques, like for example AlexNet, where they did the parallel programming, and they used the multiple deep neural networks and transformer or attention, since you mentioned that. As just kind of like I think it just kind of shows homage to like how amazing the brain actually is, because it's, even though if we were to try and model how the brain functions itself, it would still give us worse answers than if we were to do all of our other techniques. So it's kind of like the magic of the brain. Like, we don't know how to, like, even if we try and draw it out perfectly, we still can't do what it can do. And our best techniques to mimic its outputs are something else, that are just like these crazy mathematical optimization problems with a fixed amount of data.
But I think I agree with that. I think there's another side of things though, which is like efficiency and like compute efficiency, energy efficiency, learning rate, right? Like, brains can do a lot of one-shot stuff, right? They do a lot of stuff on the kind of trivial amount of energy with a trivial amount of information. Now, how, right? Like, there's probably like the wiring is a big part of that, and that's kind of evolution helping. But I think that the area where if there's going to be improvements and kind of information coming in and in directions that we want that aren't burn the Amazon rainforest to train the next GPT, right? Then it's like having a potentially a different approach to, I don't know, like fundamentally a different approach to your like learning infrastructure or your computational infrastructure. Like that would be the things where neuroscience maybe has got something to offer. But in terms of performant, execution, that's probably the direction of travel is not from neuroscience to ML at this point, and it probably isn't going to become that as far, I don't think. But that's, I don't know if anyone really thought that at any point. Maybe people did think that like 70 years ago, but
It started off with that,
yeah.
the whole idea of that propagation, these neuroscience inspired all the designs. We're like, oh, this has merit, like this is working. But then next thing you know, they're pulling from all of these crazy different controlled theoretic, like learning theory of nonlinear optimization. And then you kind of have to pause it for a second and go, I don't think the brain does that.
Yeah.
It's more so of an efficient mathematical concept that seems to work. Can we really like say this is exactly what the brain does? That's kind of, now you're like pulling strings.
Yeah, I think where it goes to, I've seen your hand, Andrew, by the way, on that, is like you maybe find out from some elegant or inelegant series of investigation that certain things can approximate backprop, for example, at least like the key elements of backprop, and those are things that are kind of biologically plausible mechanisms that, if you hadn't like spent a lot of time studying like characterizing backprop, you wouldn't have gone there. But the the actual mechanics of backprop are just like not biologically possible, right? Like moving information back and forth in the way, like up and down a tree in the way that is what like update steps do. Like there's no way that neural systems can implement that kind of that kind of gradient structure, right? But maybe there's other ways of setting up a network at the end of the day that constructs things that have those have properties that are similar to that, or at least perform similarly to that without with a more kind of plausible individual elements.
We looked at the inhibition, exhibition, like sigmoid or ReLU kind of things. Like those are definitely used in common practice.
Oh yeah.
And those,
yeah, those elements fine, but backprop as and then updates, right? And then it's really like the information bit, right? It's kind of supervised. It's just supervised learning, full stop. But so like RL is like already in a better place, but that's probably not most of brain learning. Sorry, Andrew.
Signals on going through a linear lines, right? All on like the geometry which we discussed, like the curvature of the geometry and how or curve might influence error, and that is like a more modern way of what error is. And I feel like that might also apply to the brain, because we have this signal travels through very complex curves that will contribute to how we apply error. The only reason why they think that they give update rules is because we want to use a system, which isn't the best representation.
Yeah. Although simplicity helps as well, right? Like at least there's a time and a place for simplicity, and in computational neuroscience, we use it a lot, but we have to appreciate that we're kind of deviating from optimality, we're deviating from biology, we're often in a bit of weird space when we've made a lot of simplifications. Okay, any other questions, comments? There's good discussion going on here, guys. Happy with that. If nothing burning, then we'll take a break. 4 o'clock now, so see you back in about 10 minutes, guys. And yeah, I'll pull up your browsers if you want to join in with the tutorial. Okay, hi folks on the call. So we're back. I'm going to so we have the notebook tutorial for today. Has everyone got the link? Is everyone trying to repost it? Yeah. Yep. Link again. Oops. Oh, wait. I think I posted the wrong one. I posted the TA one, not the student one. Oops. Okay. The difference between these two, I guess this is one time to let you know. So we have for each of these tutorial co-op notebooks, there's a student version and a TA version. There's questions in them, and the TA version has the answers in. I think I may have committed the cardinal sin that Parza very much asked me to not do, of posting the TA notebook before, but I think the one I just dropped at least is the student notebook. So please use that one. Unless you want to see the answers. But the answers, by the way, to kind of repeat so that people are familiar, but I think we've said this a few times, is that there are exercises. So we had our assignment 1, which was the exercises from the first few. Assignment 2 will be the exercises from the next few. And they're, mostly relatively easy questions that are kind of listed throughout that just ask you to kind of do something with what's in the notebook. So that's what I mean by the questions and the answers there. Okay, so the link's there for you. Now I'm going to try the screen share on the Chrome. So guys on the call, so we have a 20-minute presentation that Parza kindly recorded for us before he went on his 10-day meditation retreat. I'm gonna kind of play that now, but the first thing and the kind of key thing is that I want to know that you can hear it, and that's the thing that I'm not 100% sure is going to work. So let's find that out. So I'm going to try sharing and then playing this. And then what I want to know, so maybe someone on the call can let me know if you're hearing this. And I guess, is it coming through Zoom? Are you hearing this through Zoom? We're not even hearing it in the room yet, so, but I think it's not anything to hear just yet. Oh. Okay. Oh, this computer got audio. Probably should have got this sorted before we reconvened. Come to think of it. I feel like we should be hearing this. Well, that's nice. Okay, it's a start. Okay, so an unexpected thing, which is that we can't even hear in the room. Enable share audio. Okay, that's a good pointer. See if that works. Where is a share audio in Zoom? Maybe in audio settings. Hmm. Sorry for the delay, guys. Bear with me. I'm looking for share audio. Share sound. Aha. Okay. Are we going to be able to hear this now? No. Okay. Okay. Selected share sound. We are to hear. That's not a bad idea.
You can use different mathematical
Oh,
tools, mathematical
Jimmy.
frameworks to approximate this decision-making process. That is not to say this is exactly how the brain works. It's just a tool that we use to model decision making. A very simple
So I think.
decision.
All right.
If
I think we got it. I think just the there is no audio at the start of the recording. Was the problem? Sorry. Yeah. Okay. So hopefully you guys caught that on the call. Was yeah, looks like we've got no audio here for the first. How long?
so you briefly were exposed to this experiment in the
First 2 minutes. But I think that's fine because I think that's kind of just set up. So I'm gonna kind of start it off from when we start to get audio, and then I'm gonna do what I usually do, which is go to the corner, keep an eye on the chat, and also kind of follow on the tutorial. But I'll also keep an eye on. Let us know if you start to have issues with the audio or with anything else. Okay. Otherwise,
used to
we'll
we
pick
used
this
to
up from
model
when the
this.
sound starts. I think is coming up. So there. Okay, I'll put on the screen. Oh, excuse me. Bear with me. Okay.
You can use different mathematical tools, mathematical frameworks to
Okay, so final job is to get this on the screen in front of us. Which think if I minimize this. Mhm.
We're exposed to this experiment in the lecture, but not to a lot of
All right, I think we're kind of where we want to be now. Hopefully
you can
people can
use different
see
mathematical tools, mathematical frameworks to
on
approximate
the
this decision-making process.
on
That
the
is not to
call,
say
you're seeing the
this is
screen
exactly
share.
how the brain works. You can use
Yeah,
different
okay. Oh, set the way. So this is going to run for about 20
you
minutes.
can use different mathematical tools, mathematical frameworks to approximate this decision-making process. That is not to say this is exactly how the brain works. It's just a tool that we use to model decision making. A very simple way is a drift diffusion model, and I'm going to describe you that model in the context of a question. Of an experiment. So you briefly were exposed to this experiment in the lecture, but not to a lot of details. So this is the random dot movement experiment, and essentially what you're seeing here is
This is line it's going to get, I'm afraid.
participants are presented with a set of moving dots, or one circle within it there's moving dots, and they're moving, and they have to estimate what is the general flow of the dots. So let me just show you three different examples with varying degrees of coherence. So here, this is one trial. In the first trial, there's zero coherence. So all the dots are moving randomly. So there's no one particular direction that the dots are moving. So here, you wouldn't be able to make a decision because there's no decision to be made. And the task of the participant, I should clarify, is to make the decision of the direction. So here you can see that it's a bit harder to tell where the general flow is going, but it's if you look closely after a while, you'll see that it's moving to the right. This is where the coherence is about 50%. So 50% of the dots are actually moving coherently. In this example, it's very clear, as you can immediately tell where the dots are moving, and this is where all of them are congruent. So in this example is trying to demonstrate our decision-making process, specifically our accuracy and more importantly, our response time. So intuitively, you would think that in the case that the signal is a bit noisy, not very clear, you would take longer to decide. And when the signal is very sharp and very crisp and very immediate, very strong, you would be able to make that faster. So this is where the drift diffusion model framework can be applied to approximate this decision-making process. So this is the equation for the drift diffusion model. It's saying that the rate of change of your, let me just define the variables first. This is saying that X is you can think of X as a accumulation of evidence. After a certain threshold, you have enough evidence to make a decision. And if X is below a certain amount, you're still like undecided, still thinking about it, but once it crosses a threshold, then you would be able to make a decision. So this is saying that the change of this evidence gathering is equal to a scalar A, which is the strength of the evidence, how salient it is, how prominent it is, multiplied by well, that scales how it moves, plus a noise term, because the signal that you're seeing is always kind of noisy. It's not very clear. So the amount of noise will also model your decision-making power. So let's, and this is a pretty simple example. Rate of change of X is equal to AX plus C times mu, or eta in this case, just random noise. And let me show you what this means in practice. So this is examples of different trials with different evidence strengths, but let's work with the interactive, which it makes more intuitive sense. Let me shift this to only one trial number. So here, this decision making, I'm supposed to say if there's a movement, right? So imagine at the threshold level here, I have enough evidence that I can say there's a movement happening. Now, if there's no general movement, right? A is 0. A would be like the strength of the movement, the cohesive movements of all the dots together. If that's not present, if it's not strong enough, then I'll kind of like, wander around still undecided. And the process is still a bit noise driven. So maybe like, I think maybe, oh yeah, maybe they're kind of moving to this direction, but no, maybe not. And so I'm kind of like, moving around a baseline with some sort of noise. But as you can see, just if it's just noise driven, it will take a lot of time for me to make a decision. It might not even be the right decision, right? But if I, for example, increase the evidence strength, that cohesiveness, the cohesion of the moving dots together, you can see as I increase the evidence, the faster that linear term goes up, and the faster I'm able to make a decision. This. Well, this is negative actually. Yeah. So yeah. And as I increase it, the response time would decrease. And then if I also decrease the noise, if it's very clear, very crisp, where the movement is happening with not a lot of jitter, then it's also much easier to make a decision. Even when it's much more reliable to make the decision. I will be able to make that same decision over and over in multiple different trials. So let's see the effect of having different trials. If I have low amount of noise, it's pretty consistent. It's going to be the same thing every time because there's zero uncertainty of like what's happening. And, I have some sort of evidence of like, I can see what's happening with some robust strength. So I'll be able to make a decision. But as I increase the noise, as you can imagine, then it becomes a bit more random, my decision-making process. Now, on average, maybe like 5 out of 7 trials, I make the right decision. But because of random noise fluctuations, sometimes I also make the wrong decision as well. So this is one way we can actually model our decision-making process. So for example, if we estimate our reaction time and our precision, the number of correct trials, like, if they're actually going the direction that we say or not, we can see that as the evidence strength increases, then our accuracy increases, which is not surprising. This is congruent with empirical findings. And as the evidence increases, the reaction time decreases, which is again follows what we actually see in behavioral experiments. So, but is this to say that the brain works in this particular way? Well, not really, because it's a very simplistic model, and if you look at it, it's only a binary decision-making process. It requires a threshold that we set in a somewhat arbitrary manner. We're saying like after enough evidence has been accumulated, which is it's very arbitrary definition. But it is a mathematical framework of making decisions. Now we're gonna move on to another framework of actually um, uh, belief updating, which is a probabilistic way, that takes into account, it's a more generalizable, more simplistic way that accounts for the uncertainty and the evidence at the same time. And that would be through probabilistic inference. So probabilistic inference, I mean, it's a big topic on its own, and I wouldn't be able to get into too much detail on it, although it's a very fascinating framework. But essentially, it's at its core, it's based upon Bayes' theorem. So the Bayes' theorem is essentially saying that there's a posterior, your updated belief about something is dependent on the prior multiplied by a likelihood and divided by a normalization term. So so in this case, the Bayes theorem about belief updating doesn't necessarily follow the example that I want to say, but essentially the one of the powers, one of the abilities of this framework is that I can actually represent uncertainty and evidence at the same time within the same sort of variable. If I define my variable as a distribution rather than a definite number, a scalar number plus a noise term. So here, for example, I have a probability just a variable p, which is a probability distribution, and I'm going to approximate it with a normal Gaussian. So this Gaussian, it can be defined as a mean with the mean and with a standard deviation. So we're gonna go over another example that's gonna help us understand how this framework or it can actually be applied. So you also went through this in your lecture, albeit not in too much detail. So the experiment here was that participants were supposed to estimate the length of a block, a wooden block or something. And they do it in two different ways, through two different modalities. They can either touch it and get an estimate of like how wide it is just by touch, by the sense of touch. And they can also look at it and give an estimation of how wide it is just by seeing it. So for example, if it's like a 9 centimeter block, if I touch it, I'd be like, I think it's like maybe like 8, 7, or maybe 9. So my answer is like 8 plus or minus 1, some sort of deviation, some answer, some mean plus standard deviation, so some plus or minus 1. But if I look at it, it would, generally your sense of sight is sharper than your sense of touch. If I look at it, I'll be like, maybe it's like 9.5 plus or minus half a centimeter. So the accuracy of my visual, the precision of my visual estimate would be higher, right? So let's see how I can combine both the information from my touch and my vision to actually make a more informed decision that encapsulates both sources of information to actually make a decision. So here, so here, this is the representations of the information content of each source of each modality that we're looking at. The green is the tactile source. We'll say at 9 plus a wide range, and the visual is the blue is the visual. So you can see that the first thing you can see is that the standard deviation of the blue is much smaller. That means it's a more precise estimation. You're not very uncertain about where it is because, well, your senses are pretty sharp, so you can give a much higher accuracy of where the what the length of the so what's interesting here is that now we can actually combine these two sources of information in a very natural way to get a combined effect, to get an updated belief that's informed by two sources. And that's just multiplying the two Gaussians together over as a normalized term. So this is where the Bayes theorem comes in. It's the variables don't exactly match one to one here, where essentially it's one source of one distribution multiplied by the other divided by the normalization term. That would give you your updated belief. So let's see how that works. If that actually, why that's actually so intuitive and so such a normative way of actually updating beliefs. So this is saying, this method is saying that the source of information that has the highest precision is going to be weighed more strongly. So for example, let me just make it more apparent. So if I have my visual sense is saying just like 15 centimeters, right? And I'm pretty sure about that. I have a low standard deviation. And my sense of touch is saying maybe it's 7, maybe it's 8. So it's not very precise. You can see my update, my combined belief is going to be more weight towards my the modality with the higher precision. So this is exactly what happens. And this is just me multiplying it and multiplying the two Gaussians and normalizing them. So that's pretty cool, right? That it automatically weighs it in proportion to its evidence, to its precision, to its the strength of the evidence. Now, if I were to, for example, decrease the standard deviation, make my tactile information more precise, you can see that the updated belief slowly changes towards the green as well here. And that's then that actually maps onto your your everyday experience as well. This is how you actually think about different things. You weigh what you see based on what the value of it is, but how also how reliable that source is. So that's pretty cool. And this is saying how you actually how the mean. So this is also a different Gaussian. So the product of two Gaussians would also be a Gaussian. So this is saying how we can calculate the moments of the updated Gaussian, the combined distribution, based on the variables of each component. Now this is, I mean, if you just have a distribution and multiply them, but like you can also like calculate this based on the moments of the distributions without having to use the whole distribution. Anyway, this is the precision or the standard deviation term or the precision term, and this is the mean. This is how you can see it. So here we're going to be looking at 3 different examples that we kind of like went over. We'll go over it again. So this is where both of the modalities have equal reliability. You can see that the effect is going to be just the sum of both of them. This is where the blue has more reliability, then you'll be shifted more towards the blue. This is where the green has more reliability, and you'll be shifted towards the green. Now, here, well, this is a little widget that you can use to answer the exercise. So I'm not going to go over the exercise because that's what you guys are supposed to be doing. But essentially, this is a very this is the basics of this is a very foundational piece of many different frameworks that explain belief updating, like predictive processing, active inference. There's so many different more complicated frameworks, more complex frameworks of cognition and belief representation. But at the core of it, they all share this the basics of the Bayes theorem that I just explained to you. So now we're going to move on to part 3, which is saying, well, if that's the case, how can the brain actually represent that information? How can the brain represent this probabilistic information? And so one way of actually thinking about that is saying that, well, the information from in the brain at different scales, obviously, and we're focused on the scale of a neuron, it's represented in its firing rate, right? So the rate of the firing, the rate itself, how many, like what hertz, yeah, like 10 hertz, 20 hertz, whatever. That would be your the value, and the deviation, how consistently it fires at that frequency, would be the standard deviation. I believe it would be that precision. So and this is backed up by empirical findings as well. So there was another experiment, I think in the 60s, Hebel and Weasel, with the taking an electrode, recording firing activity from neurons in the occipital cortex of a cat. They saw, very accidentally actually, but they saw that specific neurons are attuned to specific orientations of lines. So they preferentially fire at, like, for example, 90 degrees, or like 0 degrees, or like 45 degrees. So it's like each neuron has a tuning curve, a preferential set of a stimulus that it preferentially fires at. So that what that would look like is something like this. So here we have like a bunch of different neurons, and this again, and this is in the context of that experiment of like firing to orientations of lines. So we have different neurons, each tuned to different optimal frequencies. So let's focus on neuron 3, which is like about is firing when it fires maximally when it sees an upright an upright column. So that is not to say that it doesn't fire at other frequencies. In fact, it has a baseline firing at all times. The neurons are always active. They fire at some sort of frequency always. But as you get closer to your preferred stimulus, then the firing rate increases. So because this is kind of this is called a von Mises, I'm not pronouncing it correctly, but a von Mises distribution, which is something like a Gaussian distribution when you have a circular axis. So this is just a linearized version of it, and this is on the circular axis. You can see that on a preferential value, it fires maximally, but it also has a baseline firing rate. So this is the equation that we're using here. So this is the baseline, the firing rate with this tuning. This gives you the tuning curve. The firing rate of the tuning curve is dependent on a baseline activity, which is always there, plus this sort of like bump shape that you see, and this is where you would get that. And SI is your preferred stimulus, and S is what you're presented with, what the neuron's presented with. Okay, so here, what we're doing is actually simulating this experiment. We're saying like our neuron has a tuning curve, and we're saying that there's some sort of noise associated with firing as well. So we're randomly giving this neuron different neurons with different orientations, right? Different lines with different orientations, and seeing how it would potentially fire. So each gray dot is an individual trial. And what we see here is that when you average across all the trials, it maps on to the shape of that tuning curve, which is, well, not surprising, because it's how we initialize the model, right? But that's not necessarily how this is just a framework that it's a mathematical framework that we imposed, a model that we imposed to be able to describe the data. But if you want to make it more biologically grounded, then we can come back to one of the earlier models of the neuron that we explored, I think in lecture 1 or 2, which was the Poisson model. And the Poisson model is a spiking model, which gives you this firing rate, and also gives you a standard deviation of that firing rate, how consistently it fires. So if we substitute the firing pattern, the firing mechanism of a simulation with a Poisson model, we can actually see that what happens is that it gives us exactly the same sort of like shape as what we saw in the tuning curve. So this is again the observed firing rate, and this is the Poisson distribution, the theoretical distribution that we get from the Poisson model. So yeah, this is kind of like also saying that this probabilistic encoding can actually be this. There's biological backing to say how this probabilistic encoding can take place within the brain, specifically here within the neuron. And when we use a more biological framework, then we see that this is also replicated. So all in all, this is kind of saying that the brain encodes information in a probabilistic manner that it contains information about variables, about representations, but also their uncertainty, the reliability of them. And with that, yeah, that it would be the conclusion of this tutorial. Hope you guys enjoyed, and email me any questions that you guys have. Thanks.
Okay, so a little run of pause that. Are you hearing me on the call? I'll just kind of field any questions in the room if people have some. Obviously, I'm not the person who was speaking just now, but I can try if there's some specific questions people have. Otherwise, I'm happy to wrap up, but we're at time now anyway. So, good session, guys. Thanks for the discussion in the middle. I like it. Happy to have more of that in the time we have left. And yeah, have a good week. Oh, and I just added the links on the Moodle to the slides, PowerPoint, and also the tutorial Colab notebook, and also the recording that we just had. So everything's up to date on the Moodle as well. Have a good week, guys.